The British royal family has a secret they've been hiding for over 200 years. A secret so explosive that historians have spent centuries trying to bury it. What if I told you that the grandmother of Queen Victoria, the woman whose bloodline runs through every single living British royal today, was black? Her name was Queen Charlotte. And this is the story they never wanted you to know. Walk into the royal collection today, and you'll find dozens of portraits of Queen Charlotte. But here's what's strange. They don't all look like the same person. Some show a woman with distinctly African features, broad nose, full lips, darker complexion. Others show her looking completely European, as if she'd been whitewashed with each new painting. This wasn't an accident. This was policy. Let's go back to 1761. Britain is at the height of its colonial expansion. The transatlantic slave trade is generating obscene wealth for British merchants. Ships leave Liverpool and Bristol loaded with manufactured goods, sail to West Africa to buy enslaved people, then cross to the Caribbean and American colonies, where those human beings are sold for sugar, tobacco, and cotton. This triangle of trade is making Britain the richest empire on earth. And in this exact moment, when Britain's economy is literally built on the enslavement of black people, King George III chooses his bride. Her name is Sophia Charlotte, of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, a minor German princess from a tiny duchy most people had never heard of. She's 17 years old. She speaks no English. And according to multiple historical sources, she has African ancestry. Here's where it gets interesting. Charlotte's family tree traces back 9 generations to Margarita de Castro e Sousa, a Portuguese noblewoman from the 15th century. Now, Portugal in the 1500s wasn't like other European countries. For centuries, Portugal had been occupied by the Moors, North African Muslims who ruled the Iberian Peninsula for over 700 years. During this time, extensive mixing occurred between African Moors and Portuguese nobility. It wasn't just common, it was inevitable. The Portuguese royal family, by the time we get to the 16th century, had significant Moorish, meaning North African, meaning black, ancestry running through multiple family lines. Margarita de Castro e Sousa descended directly from King Alfonso III of Portugal and his mistress Madragana, who historians now believe was a Moorish noblewoman. That African blood passed down through 9 generations until it reached a teenage girl in a small German duchy, who was about to become Queen of England. When Charlotte arrived in England in 1761 for her wedding, people noticed immediately. Sir Walter Scott, one of Britain's most famous writers, didn't mince words. He described her as having a true mulatto face. A mulatto face. That's not ambiguous language. The physician Baron Christian Friedrich Stockmar, who knew the royal family personally, wrote that Charlotte was small and crooked, with a true mulatto face. Again, that word, mulatto. A specific term used in the 18th and 19th centuries to describe people of mixed African and European ancestry. Even Queen Victoria's personal physician, who had no reason to fabricate such details, noted the Queen's Negro physiognomy. These weren't hostile accounts from enemies of the crown. These were observations from people within the royal circle itself. But here's the most damning evidence: the portraits themselves. Look at Charlotte's earliest portraits, painted by respected artists like Allan Ramsay in 1761 and 1762, right after she became queen. In these paintings, her features are unmistakable: broader nose, fuller lips, darker skin tone, and a facial structure that clearly shows African ancestry. Ramsay painted what he saw. But then, something changes. As decades pass and different artists paint the queen, her features gradually become more Europeanized. Her nose gets narrower, her lips get thinner, her skin gets lighter. By the time you reach later portraits, you'd never guess these were paintings of the same woman. This wasn't artistic interpretation. This was historical revisionism painted in oil on canvas. Why would they do this? Because by the late 1700s, Britain had a massive problem. The abolition movement was gaining strength. People were starting to question the morality of slavery. Activists like Olaudah Equiano and Ottobah Cugoano, black men who had survived slavery and learned to write, were publishing devastating first-hand accounts of the slave trade's horrors. And Britain's response was to double down on racist pseudoscience. They needed to justify slavery, so they created an entire intellectual framework claiming that black people were biologically inferior. Scientists published books arguing that Africans were a separate, lesser species. Philosophers wrote treatises claiming black people lacked souls. Artists created racist caricatures that dehumanized African features. Now imagine the British establishment's nightmare scenario. Their own queen has African blood. The woman who sits beside King George III, who births 15 children, including the future King George IV, and King William IV, who becomes the grandmother of Queen Victoria, this woman carries the very ancestry they're claiming makes people subhuman. It's an impossible contradiction. How do you justify enslaving millions of Africans while your own monarchy has African blood? How do you publish scientific racism claiming black people are inferior when your queen is literally related to them? You can't. So you erase it. You commission new portraits that make her look more European. You stop mentioning the Portuguese ancestry. You dismiss anyone who points out her features as being rude or scandalous. And most importantly, you make sure this truth never makes it into the official historical record. But erasing Charlotte's ancestry meant erasing something else. The truth that the entire British royal family from that point forward carried African blood. Think about this. Charlotte and George III had 15 children. Those children married into other European royal families. They had children of their own. Those children had children. By the time you get to the 21st century, every single living descendant of Queen Charlotte, including King Charles III, Prince William, and Prince Harry, carries that same genetic heritage. The British royal family has African ancestry. Full stop. And certain members of the family seem to know it. There are accounts of Queen Victoria, Charlotte's granddaughter, being described with similar features. Darker skin for a European royal, broader facial structure. Her nickname in the family was Mrs. Brown, not just because of her relationship with John Brown, but some historians suggest because of her complexion. Prince Albert, Victoria's husband, also reportedly had Moorish ancestry through his own German lineage. The genetic evidence kept accumulating, generation after generation, even as the official story kept denying it. Jump forward to 1940. A black American historian named J.A. Rogers published a book called Sex and Race, where he explicitly identified Queen Charlotte as having African ancestry. The British establishment ignored him completely. He was dismissed as a fringe theorist, pushing black nationalist propaganda. Then, in 1999, PBS aired a documentary called Frontline: The Blurred Racial Lines of Famous Families that investigated Charlotte's ancestry. They brought in genealogists. They traced her family tree back through those 9 generations to Margarita de Castro e Sousa. They connected her to the Moorish nobility of Portugal. The evidence was substantial. The British response? Silence. The royal family made no comment. Most British historians dismissed it as speculation, and mainstream history books continued teaching that the British monarchy was purely European, with no African heritage. Here's where modern science enters the story. In the 21st century, we have DNA testing. We can trace genetic ancestry with remarkable accuracy. And multiple geneticists have now stated that based on genealogical records, Queen Charlotte almost certainly had African ancestry. Dr. Mario de Valdes y Cocum, a historian of the African diaspora, spent years researching Charlotte's genealogy. His conclusion? She was directly descended from a black branch of the Portuguese royal house. But still, the official position remains ambiguous. The royal family won't authorize DNA testing of Charlotte's remains. The British establishment won't definitively acknowledge her ancestry. The textbooks still don't teach it. Why? Because admitting Queen Charlotte was black means admitting something even more uncomfortable. The entire British royal family has been of African descent for over 250 years, even as the British Empire was enslaving, colonizing, and claiming the biological inferiority of African people across the globe. Here's the question nobody wants to ask. Did Queen Charlotte herself know? The answer is almost certainly yes. She would have known her own family history. She would have been aware of the Moorish ancestry in her Portuguese lineage. And based on her actions, she seems to have acknowledged it in subtle ways. Charlotte was unusually sympathetic to black people for someone in her position. She personally supported Olaudah Equiano and his abolition work, extraordinary for a queen whose husband's government was profiting from slavery. She showed interest in African culture and collected African art at a time when such things were considered primitive. Some historians have even suggested that Charlotte's famous interest in botany and her creation of Kew Gardens was influenced by African botanical traditions passed down through her family's Moorish heritage. She created one of the world's greatest botanical collections, preserving plants from Africa and around the world. She also reportedly faced mockery from the British aristocracy about her appearance. There are accounts of nobles making cruel comments about her looks, using coded racist language. She would have understood exactly what they meant. Charlotte lived her entire adult life knowing a truth that the empire around her was desperately trying to hide. She was black. Or at the very least, she was mixed race. And she sat on the throne of an empire that enslaved people who looked like her ancestors. Now here's the twist that changes everything. In 1865, the American Civil War ended, and slavery was abolished in the United States. In Britain, slavery had been abolished in 1833. Both nations spent decades claiming they'd done the moral thing, that they'd freed the enslaved and moved past racism. But in 1865, Charlotte's granddaughter, Queen Victoria, was at the height of her power. She was Empress of India. She ruled over hundreds of millions of colonized people of color. The British Empire was extracting wealth from Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean while claiming that Europeans were racially superior and bringing civilization to savage peoples. And the woman presiding over this entire racist imperial system was the granddaughter of a black queen. She carried African blood while her empire enslaved African people. She benefited from racist ideology while being part of the group that ideology claimed was inferior. The hypocrisy is staggering. But it gets worse. Every single British monarch after Charlotte descended from her. George IV, her son. William IV, her son. Victoria, her granddaughter. Edward VII, her great-grandson. George V, Edward VIII, George VI, Elizabeth II, and now Charles III, all descended from Queen Charlotte, which means the same royal family that presided over colonizing Africa, that created racist laws in their colonies, that benefited from centuries of anti-black racism. That family has African ancestry running through every generation. Prince Harry married Meghan Markle, a biracial American woman with black heritage. The British tabloids attacked her viciously, with racism that was barely coded. They called her exotic. They criticized her looks. They treated her as an outsider, contaminating the pure British royal family. But Meghan wasn't bringing black ancestry into the royal family. It was already there. It had been there for 250 years. Harry was already of partial African descent. Their children were simply continuing a heritage that had never actually left. The entire racist backlash against Meghan Markle was based on a lie. The lie that the royal family was purely white European. The lie that had been maintained through centuries of painted portraits, rewritten histories, and deliberate erasure. Here's the truth that makes this story so dangerous to acknowledge. If the British establishment admits Queen Charlotte was black, they have to admit that the entire ideological foundation of British colonialism was based on a lie. They told themselves and the world that Europeans were superior. That white skin meant civilization, intelligence, and the right to rule. They used this lie to justify enslaving millions, colonizing continents, and extracting wealth that made Britain rich beyond measure. But if their own queen was black, then everything falls apart. How can you claim racial superiority when your monarch doesn't meet your own racial criteria? How can you enslave people based on their African ancestry when your king's children have that exact same ancestry? The answer is, you can't. So you hide it. You paint over it. You dismiss the evidence. You call anyone who mentions it a conspiracy theorist or an activist with an agenda. But here's what they couldn't hide: Charlotte's legacy in other ways. Kew Gardens, which she expanded, became one of the world's most important centers for botanical science, preserving thousands of African plant species. The town of Charlotte, in North Carolina, founded during her reign, was named after her, and would later become a major city in the American South. Her children and grandchildren spread her genetic heritage throughout European royalty. And, most importantly, the truth survived. In oral histories of black communities who always knew, in the genealogical records that careful researchers preserved, in those early portraits that showed her real face before the whitewashing began. Here's why this matters beyond just one queen. Queen Charlotte's story is proof of something much larger: that racial categories are social constructs, not biological facts. She was considered European enough to marry a king, but she carried the same African ancestry that was used to justify enslaving millions. The difference wasn't genetic. It was political. Her story proves that the racial hierarchies used to justify colonialism and slavery were always about power, never about biology. That the science of racial superiority was always pseudoscience designed to justify theft and violence. And her story proves that black history isn't separate from European history, or American history, or world history. It's woven throughout. It's in the royal bloodlines. It's in the genetic code. It's everywhere, even where it was most violently erased. So who was the last black queen of England? Technically, it was Queen Elizabeth II, who died in 2022, carrying the same African ancestry that Charlotte brought into the royal line. But that's not the full answer. The real answer is, there never was a last black queen, because the British establishment never acknowledged there was a first one. They successfully erased Queen Charlotte's African heritage from the official record. They painted over her features. They dismissed the evidence. They maintained the lie for 250 years. But erasure isn't the same as non-existence. Charlotte was real. Her ancestry was real. And that heritage continues in every living descendant of the British royal family today. This story isn't just about one queen. It's about how history gets written, who gets to tell it, and what happens to the truths that powerful people find inconvenient. Black history isn't a separate subject to be taught during 1 month a year. It's human history. It's royal history. It's world history. And it's been systematically suppressed because acknowledging it would mean acknowledging that the hierarchies we've built, racial, social, economic, are artificial constructs maintained through violence and lies. Queen Charlotte's story survived 250 years of erasure because truth has a way of persisting. The portraits still exist. The genealogical records are still there. The DNA evidence is available if anyone had the courage to test it. And the descendants of people who knew the truth kept telling the story, even when no one wanted to listen. The next time someone tells you that black people have no history, remember Queen Charlotte. Remember that African blood runs through the veins of British royalty. Remember that the same empire that claimed racial superiority was ruled by a mixed-race queen. Remember that history is written by the powerful, but truth is written in genetics, in portraits, in documents they forgot to destroy, and in the memories of people who refused to forget. Queen Charlotte was black. The British royal family has African ancestry, and no amount of painted portraits, rewritten textbooks, or official denials can erase that truth. The last black queen of England? She's still on the throne. She's been there for centuries. They just keep pretending she isn't. Remember her name. Tell her story. Because the most revolutionary act in a world built on lies is simply refusing to forget the truth.